So as I was saying, I'd like to talk about the many failings of the criminal justice system, but also reasons why for hope. And I'd like to start by telling you about a man named Weldon Angelos. Weldon grew up in Utah, where he was raised by his father, a Greek immigrant. In 2002, he was busted 3 times for selling marijuana, to police informants. Each time he carried a gun, either in his car or in a holster on his leg. But he wasn't a drug dealer by trade. He had no criminal record. He never used the gun to threaten anyone. But prosecutors in Salt Lake City wanted to make an example out of Weldon. And when he refused to take a plea bargain that would have locked him up for 15 years, prosecutors there threw the book at him. And they piled up charges that led to a 55-year sentence without parole. So at the time of his arrest, Weldon was 23 years old, and unless his sentence is commuted, there's a good chance he will spend the rest of his life in prison for selling marijuana. And when he was taken away, Weldon left 3 young daughters at home. And unfortunately, Weldon's story is not all that unusual. The United States, as you know, is the world's leading jailer. We have about 5% of the world's population, but almost a quarter of its prisoners. We lock up people for so-called crimes, like smoking marijuana or writing a hot check, that would get a relative slap on the wrist in many other industrialized countries. And for serious crimes like murder or robbery, we keep our people in prison for far longer than other nations. We hand down more life sentences as a percentage of our population than countries like Norway and Sweden hand down for all sentences combined. So how do we get to be this way? I mean, just a few decades ago, we had so few people incarcerated, fewer than 350,000 in the early 1970s, that some people were suggesting that we may be able to abolish prisons, that we may be able to get rid of them altogether. But today we have more than 2 million people locked up. So that's a 600% increase over 40 years. Well, much of the growth can be traced to the war on drugs and to mandatory minimum sentences, which require anyone convicted of a crime to receive a minimum sentence, regardless of the circumstances of the case. During the crack epidemic of the 1980s, politicians wanted to appear tough on crime. So they turned what was once considered a public health problem, drug abuse, over to the criminal justice system. And as Frederick Douglass said, in all relations of life and death, we are met by the color line. And in some ways, our mass incarceration problem is actually a race problem. Indeed, we see racial disparities at every stage of the criminal justice system. In New York City, supposedly liberal New York City, 86% of people arrested for marijuana possession are Black or Latino. 86%. Even though whites use marijuana at a higher rate. A Black male born in America today has a 1 in 3 chance of spending a year in prison. A Black male born in America today has a 1 in 3 chance of spending at least a year in prison. What would happen if 1 in 3 white boys in America were in prison? And though they make up less than 13% of our population, African Americans account for about 40% of those behind bars. And by one count, I think Michelle Alexander's count, more Blacks are under the control of the criminal justice system today than were enslaved in 1860. So Sarah Palin was right. The United States really is exceptional. When it comes to crime and punishment, we have few peers. And the consequences for our exceptionalism in this regard are profound. Our prisons are overcrowded. Our state budgets are overwhelmed. In some states, it costs $50,000 a year to keep a person locked up. So all that adds up to $60 billion a year. Actually, I read in the New York Times yesterday, $75 billion a year that we spend to house, clothe, feed, and provide health care to hundreds of thousands of people. And it would be one thing if it worked, but we are far past the point of diminishing returns. And we know that mass incarceration is not the most effective way to keep ourselves safe. And worse than the financial costs are the human costs of imprisonment. Obviously, years spent in a cell can never be regained. And when someone goes to prison, it's as if their entire family goes to prison. The family loses a breadwinner. They lose a son or a daughter, a sister or a brother. And in the case of Weldon Angelos' family, 3 daughters lost a father. And when people are released from prison, as Joan alluded to, as the vast majority of inmates are, they need to find a job, but many employers won't hire someone who's been convicted of a crime. And even if that person is well qualified for the job, they have a hard time finding a job. And despite our belief that people should be free to rejoin the community after they have paid their debts, in many states there are restrictions on gaining employment or getting a license. And in addition, people with a criminal background can face barriers to housing, education, voting, and public benefits. So in short, even after release from prison, many are forever denied the right to participate in American life. And there are consequences for communities. In parts of Washington, D.C., there are 62 men for every 100 women. Many of those missing men are incarcerated. So this means fewer men to marry, fewer male role models. In some communities, going to prison has become so routine that it no longer brings a sense of shame or family disgrace. It's just part of life. So it's easy to imagine why in some communities folks might think of the justice system as deserving of little respect. So this is a pretty bleak picture. So why do I say that there is reason for hope? Well, thanks to the Great Recession and budget pressures, there's a growing sense that we can just no longer afford it. And also we've seen an awakening among many that mass incarceration is just not working. There's a sense that we could be spending $50,000 a year not imprisoning a drug dealer, but on hiring a teacher. Why spend $60 billion or $75 billion a year on imprisoning people when we could use some of that money to invest in schools and roads and bridges? And I love the quotation in your program. It says, "He who opens a school closes a prison." And a significant drop in crime has led to less sort of tough-on-crime rhetoric that we've heard in the past. And we see this in polls. So Americans say that too many people are in prison, and an overwhelming majority in polls, including folks across political, generational, and racial lines, want to exchange prisons for more effective alternatives. So how can we take advantage of this moment? Well, here are 5 things we can do. Number 1, we could urge the Justice Department to focus its energy on truly dangerous offenders. It was nice to hear the president say recently that we have bigger fish to fry than pot smokers in Colorado and Washington State, 2 states that recently relaxed their marijuana laws. But we should take that further and prosecute only high-level cases or those in which there is a clear public safety interest. We should stop cracking down on the low and medium-level drug dealers, the Weldon Angeloses of the world. Number 2, we should urge Congress to eliminate mandatory minimum sentences. And we heard a leading senator, Pat Leahy, said last week that he would work to do just that. It's clear that the public safety benefits of mandatory minimums do not outweigh their costs in sustaining high incarceration rates. Number 3, we should find out why there are such racial disparities in the handing down of mandatory minimum sentences and consider whether prosecutorial discretion is to blame for that. Number 4, we should expand drug abuse treatment in federal prisons. and allow more federal prisoners to be released when they are elderly or ill. And number 5, we should urge the president to exercise clemency, one of his most profound powers, and at the state level to governors as well, to commute unjust sentences. Surprisingly, President Obama is by far our least merciful modern president. Despite hundreds of federal offenders unjustly imprisoned by the war on drugs, he's handed out far, far fewer pardons than Presidents Reagan or Bush or Clinton. And finally, in looking forward over the next 25 years, we need to have a dramatic shift in our approach to public safety. So over the long term, we need to move away from an incarceration model and toward a model of building families and communities that nurture children. We need to invest in schools by hiring more teachers and fewer resource officers or police officers who work in schools, so that we can put a chokehold on the school-to-prison pipeline. For reasons of both effectiveness and compassion, we should adopt strategies that emphasize opportunity rather than punishment as the guiding principle for ensuring public safety. So, given partisanship in Washington, are such reforms really possible? I mean, the Congress had a swearing-in ceremony earlier this month, and some members seemed to think that was enough work for the year. Well, given that mass incarceration is really a race problem, perhaps we should focus on less divisive issues. Well, as my boss, Mark Maurer, likes to say, suppose we were in 1955 in Alabama and civil rights leaders proposed a bus boycott. And suppose they called in pollsters who said, this just isn't going to work. We have a mostly white electorate, and white people are not going to go for this, so we should try something else. Well, we're lucky that civil rights leaders in that time were not deterred by fierce opposition. But it is true that a lot of people, black and white, will resist any reforms that lessen incarceration. Our challenge is to develop strategies and messages and campaigns that can overcome that resistance. And the Sentencing Project, where I work, has been involved in a couple of such campaigns that are instructive on this. One was on scaling back the unfair disparities that we saw between crack and powder cocaine. And another was scaling back felony disenfranchisement, or taking away people's right to vote when they commit a felony. And we've done that in about half of 50 states. We've made progress. So how did these changes come about? Well, they began with a call for racial justice, and they included a call for public safety. These combined messages have to go hand in hand. So on the crack cocaine disparity, the racial injustice was obvious. About 80% of people prosecuted for crack offenses are African American, even though blacks and whites use crack at roughly the same rates. And the penalties for crack were about 100 times greater than for powder cocaine, even though it's just another form of the same drug. So in terms of racial justice and public safety, that was just bad policy. If you lock up tens of thousands of low-level drug dealers, it doesn't matter if they are black or white or Latino. This is just a poor use of public funds to address what is essentially a substance abuse problem. So these arguments, as well as arguments of racial fairness, resonated over time. And the story has been similar for felony disenfranchisement. Advocates argued for racial justice as well as themes of democracy and public safety. So it's simply undemocratic and counterproductive to deny voting rights to people who have paid their debts to society. And bipartisan cooperation is essential. Too many political leaders are afraid of being portrayed as soft on crime, a charge that can put their careers in jeopardy. So political leaders need to have a sense that they can do the right thing and not suffer political consequences. And this is where working with conservatives such as Newt Gingrich and Grover Norquist who are part of a group called Right on Crime, where that comes in. Because by having prominent conservatives lead on this issue, it sends a message that you can be conservative, you can be concerned about cost-effective approaches to public safety, but also you can look at mass incarceration and at community building and at our approach to substance abuse and not have your political career threatened. But make no mistake, change is hard. It requires patience. It will take a long time and many steps to dismantle a system as entrenched as the prison industrial complex. But we can take heart from other movements that brought about change, like the abolitionist movement, which began long before the Civil War, before we finally ended slavery, and the women's suffrage movement, which labored for 3/4 of a century before the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote. Many of those who struggled knew that their efforts would not bear fruit in their own lifetimes, but they pressed forward on behalf of future generations. So a friend of mine, Wayne Kramer, who served time in federal prison back in the 70s for selling cocaine, and now does outreach to prisoners, says that prison is a good argument for worthlessness. Prison is a good argument for worthlessness. And I think what he means is that when we incarcerate people, we are telling them that they are nothing to us, that our society has decided to strip them of their fundamental dignity and worth as human beings. Well, our task is to remain committed to the principle that every individual has worth. And that doesn't mean we should absolve offenders of their behavior or abolish prisons. Justice requires punishment for some people who intentionally harm others. And we may need to incarcerate some people until they are no longer a danger to others. But we acknowledge that every man and woman, including those who are in prison, share a common humanity. If we can convince more people to accept that truth while showing them reforms that actually make us safer, perhaps we can take steps to humanize our response to crime. So I hope you'll join us in this effort. I look forward to visiting with some of you later, and feel free to contact me or my colleagues at the Sentencing Project with any questions about how you can help. So thank you.